On New Year's Eve, we broke into an abandoned dacha looking for a party. But when a bear trap snapped shut on my brother's leg, it wasn't the pain that terrified me. It was the sound of something waking up in the dark. The call came through at 11:45 p.m. on New Year's Eve. I was at my parents' apartment staring at the pathetic spread of Olivier salad and tangerines on the table, the muffled sounds of the state-sponsored concert on TV filling the awkward silence. My phone buzzed against the polished wood, a violent, insistent vibration. It was Lena, my brother Misha's girlfriend. I answered, expecting a slurred, Happy New Year's greeting. Instead, I got a scream, a raw, ragged sob that scraped itself into my ear. "Alex, Alex, you have to come. Oh, God, Alex." My blood went cold. "Lena? What's wrong? Where's Misha? Are you guys okay?" "We broke into her dacha for New Year. Trap. Your brother's hospitalized." The line cut out, leaving me with a dial tone that sounded like a death knell. Her words didn't make sense. Her dacha? A trap? Hospitalized? My mind reeled back just a few hours to when this whole idiotic disaster began. It had been Misha's idea, of course. It was always Misha's idea. Our original plan, a big party at a friend's apartment, had imploded when the friend's parents decided not to go out of town after all. So there we were, 4 of us. Me, Misha, Lena, and our friend Sasha, sitting in Sasha's beat-up Lada at 8 p.m. on New Year's Eve with 2 bottles of cheap champagne and nowhere to go. "I have a plan," Misha had announced, a wicked glint in his eye that always meant trouble. He was 2 years older than me and possessed a reckless charm that could convince a snowman to buy a heater. "Remember Lena's great-aunt? The one who moved to Germany? Aunt Zena?" Lena nodded slowly. "The one with the dacha out past Zelenogorsk?" "The very same," Misha beamed. "It's been sitting empty for 2 years. It's perfect. A whole house to ourselves, a fireplace, the woods. It'll be legendary." I immediately felt a knot of dread in my stomach. "Misha, you want us to break into an old lady's house on New Year's Eve?" "Break in is such an ugly term," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "We're borrowing it for a few hours. We'll be super clean, we won't break anything. She'll never even know we were there. Come on, Alyosha, what's the alternative? Sitting in Sasha's car listening to the radio, or going back to Mom and Dad's to watch the same old concert for the 20th time?" He had me there. The thought of my parents' quiet, predictable evening was suffocating. Sasha, ever the pragmatist behind the wheel, was wavering. "I don't know, man. What if there's an alarm?" "An alarm? On a babushka's dacha from the Soviet era? The most advanced technology in that place is probably a black and white television." Misha laughed. His laughter was infectious, and soon Lena was giggling too, her initial hesitation melting away. Against my better judgment, I relented. An hour later, we were bumping down a narrow, unplowed road, the Lada's headlights cutting a weak path through the thick, falling snow. The forest crowded in on both sides, ancient pines heavy with white blankets, their branches like skeletal arms reaching for the car. There was no one else out here. The isolation was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The dacha was set back from the road, a dark, 2-story wooden house that looked like it had been hibernating for decades. It was even more dilapidated than I'd imagined. Paint peeled from the window frames and a shutter hung from a single hinge, swaying gently in the wind. "See? A ghost house. No one will care," Misha said, hopping out of the car with the confidence of a conquering king. The lock on the front door was old and rusty, and it took Misha less than a minute with a piece of wire from Sasha's toolkit to jimmy it open. The click of the latch unlocking echoed unnaturally loud in the silent, snowy landscape. The air inside was stale and frigid, colder than it was outside. It smelled of dust, mothballs, and something else, something faintly metallic and damp, like old rust. We stepped in, our boots crunching on the dust-covered floorboards. Misha clicked a lighter, the small flame casting long, dancing shadows that made the furniture, draped in white sheets, look like a congregation of ghosts. "Okay, priority 1. Find the breaker box and get some lights on." Misha declared, his voice a little too loud for the oppressive silence. "Sasha, you and Lena start unpacking the food. Alex, you're with me. Let's find the electricity." I followed him reluctantly, my phone's flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. We passed a living room where portraits of stern-faced ancestors stared down at us from the walls, their eyes seeming to follow our light. The whole place gave me the creeps. It didn't feel empty, it felt waiting. We found the breaker box in a small hallway leading towards what looked like a kitchen. It was an ancient metal affair with thick, clumsy-looking switches. "Bingo," Misha whispered triumphantly. He reached out to flip the main switch. I kept my light on his face, watching the familiar, confident grin. He was in his element, the master of his own chaotic universe. He put his other hand on the wall to steady himself, taking a small step forward to get better leverage on the stiff switch. And then it happened. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a sharp, sickening thwack snap, like a dry branch breaking under a heavy boot, but deeper, faster, and made of metal. It was immediately followed by a scream that ripped out of my brother's throat, high-pitched and full of a pain so absolute and shocking it didn't even sound human. It was the sound of an animal caught in a snare. My flashlight beam jerked down from his face to the floor, and in the bobbing, frantic circle of light, I saw it. His foot was gone, vanished into the floorboards, and rising from the splintered wood around his leg were the rusted, serrated steel jaws of a bear trap. For a second that stretched into an eternity. My brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The rusted teeth of the trap were buried in my brother's shin, his jeans already dark and wet with a blossoming stain of red. The scream died in his throat, replaced by a guttural, choked gasp as he crumpled, his full weight yanking against the chain that bolted the trap to the floor joists below. "Misha!" Lena's shriek from the other room shattered my paralysis. She and Sasha came running, their own flashlights creating a chaotic dance of beams in the dusty darkness. "What happened?" "Oh my God!" Sasha yelled, skidding to a halt. Lena just stood there, her hands flying to her mouth, a thin, keening wail escaping her lips. "It's a trap, a goddamn bear trap!" I yelled, dropping to my knees beside Misha. My hands hovered uselessly over the gruesome metal jaws. "Sasha, the crowbar from your trunk, now!" While Sasha sprinted back out into the snow, I tried to talk to Misha. His face was a mask of ashen shock, his eyes wide with a pain so profound it seemed to have burned all other thoughts away. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the freezing air. Misha, look at me. It's okay. We're gonna get you out," I lied, my voice shaking uncontrollably. The coppery smell of blood was thick in the air. Sasha returned, brandishing a heavy iron crowbar. Okay, hold him steady," he grunted, wedging the tip of the bar between the trap's jaws. He put his entire weight on it, his muscles straining, his face contorted with effort. The old metal groaned in protest but didn't budge. "It's no use," he gasped, sweat dripping from his own face now. "The spring is too strong. I can't get any leverage." Misha let out another agonized cry as the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through him. Stop, you're making it worse," he wheezed, his teeth chattering. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle its way up my spine. We were in the middle of nowhere, in a house that was clearly booby-trapped, with my brother bleeding out on the floor. I ripped off my scarf and tried to fashion a tourniquet above the wound, but the trap itself made it almost impossible to get to the artery. The blood just kept welling up, thick and dark, pooling on the dusty floorboards. "My phone," Lena stammered, fumbling in her pocket with trembling hands. "I'll call an ambulance." She stared at the screen for a moment, her face falling. "No signal, nothing." Sasha checked his. "Me neither. The snow, the forest, were completely cut off." That's when I noticed it. As my flashlight beam swept across the wall near the breaker box, it illuminated a series of scratches in the dark wood. They weren't random. They were tally marks, dozens of them, grouped in fives. Below them, scratched with what looked like a nail, were crude stick figures. Each one had a leg caught in a trap identical to the one currently clamped around my brother's bone. This wasn't an old trap left by a hunter. This was deliberate. This was a system. Aunt Zena hadn't just abandoned this dacha. She had fortified it. "We have to go," Sasha said, his voice hard with a decision. He was shifting from panicked friend to survival mode. "We can't move him like this, and we can't get it off him. Lena, you're coming with me. We'll drive back towards the highway until we find a signal. We'll call for help and lead them back here." "No, I'm not leaving him," Lena cried, clutching at Misha's hand. "You have to," Sasha insisted, grabbing her arm. "Alex can stay with him. Keep him warm. Sitting here, all four of us, is a death sentence. We're wasting time." He was right. As much as I hated it, he was right. Every second Misha was attached to this thing, he was losing more blood, getting closer to shock. I nodded at Sasha, a silent, grim agreement. "Go, just hurry." Lena sobbed, but allowed Sasha to pull her towards the door. She looked back at me, her eyes pleading. "Keep him talking, Alex. Don't let him fall asleep." I nodded again, my throat too tight to speak. I watched their flashlight beams disappear out the door, heard their frantic footsteps in the snow, and then the strained groan of the Lada's engine turning over. The sound grew fainter and fainter until it was swallowed completely by the woods and the softly falling snow, leaving me and Misha in a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than any noise. Now there was only the sound of Misha's ragged breathing, the drip, drip, drip of his blood onto the floor, and the low moan of the wind outside. I huddled next to him, wrapping my own jacket around his shoulders, whispering nonsense, anything to fill the silence, just as Lena had asked. His eyes were half closed, his skin clammy and cold. The minutes stretched on, each one a lifetime. That's when I heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was a distinct sound from directly above us. A slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard, followed by a long pause, and then another one, closer to the top of the staircase that I could just make out in the darkness of the main room. Someone else was in the house with us. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, suffocating silence. Every horror movie cliché I'd ever scoffed at flooded my mind. The isolated cabin, the trap, the injured friend, and now the sound upstairs. I grabbed the heavy iron crowbar Sasha had left behind, my knuckles white, and positioned myself between Misha and the darkness of the main room. I held my breath, straining my ears, listening for another sign, praying I had imagined it. Nothing. Only the wind whispering around the eaves of the old dacha. Maybe it was just the house, I told myself, trying to calm the frantic tremor in my hands. Old wood contracts in the cold. It was nothing. "Alyosha," Misha's voice was a faint, raspy whisper. "So cold." "I know, Misha, I know. Just hang on. Sasha and Lena will be back soon," I murmured, my eyes still fixed on the stairwell. I couldn't shake the feeling. The sound had been too distinct, too intentional. It had the weight and cadence of a footstep. I shone my phone's flashlight up toward the second-floor landing, the beam cutting a nervous path through the thick gloom. Cobwebs hung in spectral curtains from the banister. Dust motes danced in the light like tiny, frantic spirits. Nothing seemed out of place. It was just an old, empty house. An old, empty, booby-trapped house where someone had kept a detailed record of their victims. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. Those tally marks weren't a warning. They were a trophy wall. I turned my attention back to Misha. His breathing was shallower now. His face had taken on a pale, bluish tint around his lips. He was going into shock. I had to do something. The tourniquet I'd tied earlier was a joke, soaked through and doing nothing to stem the bleeding. I needed pressure, real pressure. I ripped a piece of fabric from the bottom of my own t-shirt and folded it into a thick pad. "This is gonna hurt, Misha," I warned him, my voice barely a whisper. "But I have to." He gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod. I placed the pad directly over the gushing wound on his shin, as close to the trap's jaws as I could get, and pushed down with all my weight. Misha's body arched in a silent scream, a low, guttural groan tearing from his chest. His eyes rolled back in his head for a second, and I was terrified he'd passed out. Or worse. But then they fluttered open again, glazed with an agony I couldn't comprehend. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop. It was a temporary, desperate measure. Minutes crawled by like wounded animals. The only sounds were Misha's shallow breaths and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I kept talking to him, telling him stories from our childhood, anything to keep a flicker of consciousness in his eyes. And then I heard it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. A floorboard creaked upstairs, directly over the kitchen area. It was followed by a soft, dragging sound. Shh, thump, shh, thump. The sound of something heavy being pulled across a wooden floor. Adrenaline surged through me, hot and sharp. We were not alone. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice cracking with a fear I couldn't conceal. The crowbar felt flimsy and useless in my hand. The dragging stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, charged with a terrifying, predatory stillness. It was the silence of something listening, something waiting. My mind raced. Was it the owner? Had this Aunt Zena never gone to Germany at all? Was she some kind of deranged hermit living up there in the darkness, setting traps for intruders? I shone my light back towards the stairwell, my hand shaking so violently the beam danced like a strobe light. "I know you're up there. We've called the police. They're on their way." It was a pathetic bluff, and we both knew it. There was no response, just that awful, patient silence. I felt like a mouse being watched by an owl. I was torn. I couldn't leave Misha, but staying here, pinned down and vulnerable, felt like waiting for an execution. My eyes darted around the hallway, searching for anything, a weapon, a place to hide, an escape route. But there was nothing. We were caught, just like the stick figures on the wall. Then the sound changed. It wasn't dragging anymore. It was a new noise coming from the kitchen right behind me, a low rhythmic squeaking. Squeak, squeak, squeak. It was the sound of a rusty hinge, moving back and forth slowly and deliberately. I whipped around, my flashlight beam cutting through the kitchen doorway. The room was empty, just as we'd left it. A decrepit stove, a grime-covered counter, and a small square door set low in the back wall. A cellar door, and it was moving. It was slowly, inch by inch, swinging open. A wave of cold, musty air, smelling of damp earth and rot, billowed out into the hallway, carrying with it a faint, sweet, cloying odor that turned my stomach. The squeaking wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from below. My blood ran cold. The sound wasn't coming from above. It was coming from below. The cellar door continued its slow, agonizingly loud swing open, revealing a square of pitch-black nothingness. The smell intensified, a nauseating mix of damp soil, decay, and something sickly sweet, like rotting meat left out in the sun. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but Misha was chained to the floor. I was the only thing standing between him and whatever was crawling out of that hole. I tightened my grip on the crowbar, my knuckles aching. I pointed my phone's flashlight into the abyss, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive dark. I could see the top of a steep, rickety wooden ladder. Nothing else. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a pathetic squeak. The only answer was a soft, wet, scraping sound from the bottom of the ladder. Something was coming up. My heart was a wild bird trapped in my chest, beating itself bloody against my ribs. I could hear its labored breathing now, a wet, ragged wheezing that sounded ancient and diseased. A hand appeared, gripping the top rung of the ladder. It wasn't a human hand. It was gray and skeletal, with long, yellowed fingernails and patches of skin that looked loose and peeling. I gagged, stumbling back a step. Then another hand appeared, and a head slowly rose into the light. It was a woman. Or at least it had been one. Her face was a waxy, sunken horror. Her eyes were milky and unfocused, her thin lips pulled back from brown, rotting teeth in a permanent rictus. It was the face from the portraits on the wall, but desiccated, mummified. It was Aunt Zena, and she was very, very dead. But she was also moving. She hauled her emaciated body out of the cellar, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. One of her legs was twisted at a sickening angle, dragging uselessly behind her as she began to pull herself across the kitchen floor towards us. That was the dragging sound I'd heard. It hadn't been upstairs. It was a trick of the acoustics in this cursed house. She was making her slow, deliberate way towards the smell of fresh blood, towards my brother. I was paralyzed by a terror so profound it felt like my soul was trying to claw its way out of my body. This wasn't a deranged hermit. This was something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. The tally marks on the wall suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. She wasn't catching intruders. She was collecting them. Her dead eyes fixed on Misha, and a low moan escaped her throat, a sound of primal, ancient hunger. That broke my paralysis. An animalistic surge of adrenaline washed over me, a brother's desperate need to protect his own. "Get away from him!" I screamed, and without thinking I charged. I swung the heavy crowbar like a baseball bat, aiming for her head. The impact was sickening, a dull, wet crunch, like hitting a rotten pumpkin. She barely seemed to notice. She just kept crawling, one skeletal hand reaching for Misha's bleeding leg. I swung again and again, blind with panic and rage. Still, she came on. I wasn't fighting a person. I was fighting a force of nature, a thing driven by a single, insatiable need. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and landed hard on the floor beside Misha. The crowbar flew from my grasp, skittering into the darkness. Zena was almost on top of him. I was defenseless. Suddenly, a blinding light flooded the hallway, and the sound of a splintering door exploded through the house. "Police, don't move!" a voice bellowed. Two figures in heavy tactical gear stood silhouetted in the doorway, their powerful flashlights pinning the crawling horror in their beams. For a moment, even they seemed stunned into silence by the macabre scene. Behind them, I could see Sasha and a sobbing Lena. The thing that was Aunt Zena turned its head slowly towards the new light, its jaw hanging slack. One of the officers, regaining his senses, raised his rifle. "Drop to the floor!" he shouted at me. I flattened myself over Misha as best I could. 3 deafening shots rang out, echoing like thunder in the confined space. The crawling thing jerked, then collapsed into a heap and was finally, blessedly still. The next few hours were a blur of paramedics, flashing lights and hushed, incredulous voices. The medics worked frantically on Misha, finally managing to pry the trap open with a hydraulic tool. They stabilized him, loaded him onto a stretcher, and rushed him out into the snowy night. As they carried him past me, his eyes fluttered open, and he gave my hand the faintest squeeze. He was going to live. The police found the rest of the story in the cellar. It was a larder of horrors. The remains of at least a dozen other people, some caught in similar traps, were down there. The official story, the one that would make the news, was that Aunt Zena was a reclusive cannibal who had died years ago in her own trap, only to be discovered by a group of unlucky teenagers. I couldn't report what I had seen, that the corpse had been moving. They called it a stress-induced hallucination. I know what I saw. I know that old house, saturated with decades of pain and malice, had reanimated its dead mistress, turning her into a hungry guardian. Sasha and Lena found a signal about 10 minutes down the road. They told the dispatcher that their friend had fallen and broken his leg, wisely omitting the part about breaking and entering. It was only when they led the first patrol car back that the true nightmare was revealed. We all got a slap on the wrist for trespassing. Misha spent 2 months in the hospital and walks with a permanent limp, but he's alive. We never talk about what happened in that dacha. We don't need to. Sometimes, late at night, I still see her face, crawling out of the darkness. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, that some places are better left empty, and some secrets are better left buried in the cold, dark earth.